In October of 1998, a Vitrea glass dump truck backed up the gravel lane outside Harlan Buse's property in Preston County, West Virginia, and left 3 tons of slag at his gate. Warren Solt, the plant's new operations manager, had arranged it himself. He called it a courtesy. Harlan's land sat adjacent to the plant's south perimeter, and instead of paying to haul the slag to the county disposal site 12 miles east, Solt could drop it here for nothing. Harlan got free fill material. Vitrea saved the hauling fee. A practical arrangement, Solt told the County Chamber of Commerce years later, between a company and its neighbor. Harlan Buse walked out to look at the pile that October morning with his setter, Rue, at his heel, and he did not say much. He crouched at the edge of the heap, picked up a piece roughly the size of his fist, and held it to the flat gray light. What he saw there, nobody else in Preston County would have seen. Not then. 16 years after that first dump, in the spring of 2014, a woman named Marion Cross stood at a folding table at a craft fair in Morgantown and picked up a pendant Harlan had finished the previous November. Marion Cross was the senior buyer for the Craft Alliance Gallery in St. Louis, and she had been walking the Morgantown Fair since 9 that morning. She held the pendant for 47 seconds. She did not say anything for those 47 seconds. Then she set it down and said she wanted 23 pieces. The price she offered was $800 each. That is the story. What happened between October 1998 and that spring table in Morgantown is what this is about. If you have ever lived near an industrial town and watched what the plant considers waste, you may already know something about what Harlan knew. Stay close to this one. Let me tell you who Harlan Buse was. He was 59 years old at the Morgantown Fair, and he had spent 17 of the years before that arrangement with Vitrea Glass working inside the plant itself, in the batch and furnace room, before a workforce reduction in 1993 ended that chapter without ceremony. He farmed 11 acres on the south side of Morganfield and was known in Preston County for 2 things: his capacity for quiet and his eye for color. The second thing was rarer than the first. The people who knew him well said he could name the mineral content of a piece of stone from the way it sat in afternoon light, a habit he had gotten from his father, Clem, who had worked the same Glassworks 40 years before him and had spent his evenings with a field notebook writing down what he saw. Clem Buse died in 1991. Harlan found the notebook after, in the back of a kitchen drawer, under a packet of rubber bands and a folded road map. It was a standard composition notebook with a cloth cover, and inside it Clem had recorded, in pencil, 2 decades of color observations from the Vitrea batch room. What oxide combinations produced what? What happened to the batch color when the furnace ran hot? What the slag pile looked like after a week of decorative glass production versus a week of flat glass for construction. Clem had not been a scientist. He had been a pot room worker who paid attention. The notebook was the kind of document that, to a certain kind of eye, was a library. To any other eye, it was the scribbled hobby of an old glassworker with too much sentiment about color. Harlan did not try to explain the notebook to anyone. He put it on the shelf in his barn studio, beside the flat lap his father had used for polishing agate, and he let it sit there while he finished his last years at Vitrea. When the reduction notice came in 1993, he cleaned out his locker, drove his paid-off pickup home, and went back to the barn. Warren Solt arrived at Vitrea that same year, though the 2 men did not meet in any formal way until 1998, when Solt approached Harlan about the slag arrangement. Solt was 44 then, a WVU industrial engineering graduate with a tidy record of reducing disposal costs across 3 facilities before coming to Preston County, and he was not a bad man. This is worth saying plainly, because what follows could easily cast him as one. He was sincere. He was methodical. He believed, with the confidence of a man whose projections had never been seriously wrong, that industrial waste was waste. That value was something you measured in a ledger column with a dollar sign in front of it, and that a material which had already yielded everything it was designed to yield had nothing left to give. When he drove to Harlan's gate in the fall of 1998 to propose the arrangement, he was genuinely trying to be helpful. He brought the dispatch paperwork. He shook Harlan's hand. Harlan looked at the paperwork and said he would take whatever they brought. Solt looked out at the 11 acres, at the weathered barn, at Rue sitting beside the gatepost, and he said, "Mr. Buse, this is slag. It's industrial junk. You're welcome to it, but a rockhound hobby isn't going to get you anywhere with this material." He said it the way a person says something they believe is true, and are also doing you a favor by saying. Harlan looked at him for a moment. "I know what it is," he said. The first truck came 3 weeks later. Let me tell you what Harlan knew about slag that Warren Solt's industrial engineering degree had not prepared him to consider. Glass slag is what remains after a batch melt. At Vitrea's Preston County plant, the primary product lines ran flat glass for the construction market in spring and summer, and decorative glass sheets for the gift and tableware market in fall and winter. The furnaces ran continuous melts, and when a batch run ended and the furnace was cleaned or adjusted, the residual glass and flux compounds that had fused to the furnace walls and the refining equipment were scraped out and dumped. That material was slag. To Vitrea's ledger, it was zero-value industrial waste with a disposal cost attached. What Clem Buse's notebook had recorded, and what Harlan had confirmed with his own 17 years in the batch room, was that the color in that slag was real, and it was unrepeatable. The color came from the oxide compounds used to tint the primary batch. Iron oxide produced amber and deep honey brown. Manganese produced violet and a gray-black that ran almost purple in strong light. Cobalt traces left a blue that ranged from sky to near navy, depending on the furnace temperature, at scrape. Copper oxidation, rare and unpredictable, left threads of turquoise green that locked into the slag matrix like veins in agate. The mix was never the same twice. It depended on what product line Vitrea had run, at what temperature, for how long, and how the transition between runs had gone. Some of those oxides were expensive to buy commercially. Inside the slag, they were already fused, already cooled, already combined in ways no commercial colorant supplier could replicate, because no supplier would have a reason to try. Harlan had noticed in his years on the floor that the spring slag ran amber heavy. The flat glass season used clear and lightly tinted batches, and the residual iron oxide from the furnace linings came through dominant and warm. The flat glass product was not supposed to be amber. The amber was a byproduct of the iron leaching from the furnace infrastructure over the course of a long, hot season, and it ended up in the slag when the batch equipment was cleaned between runs. In the decorative glass season, fall and winter, the colorant concentrations in the batch were intentional and high. The cobalt and manganese showed up in force in those dump sections, leaving pieces with a violet-blue range that sat somewhere between sea glass and cathedral window, except denser, with an internal saturation that flat glass never achieved, because flat glass was designed to transmit light, not hold it. Harlan had spent enough time in the batch room to know that the production chemists would have considered this secondary coloring a contamination artifact, a flaw in the slag's composition rather than a feature. He was not a production chemist. He was Clem Buse's son, and he had a different framework for what a flaw was worth. He began in 2002 to sort the pile by dump date, cataloging which season's material had landed where, and assigning each sorted section a color family. He worked through the accumulated pile systematically, section by section, tagging the sorted boundaries with stakes he had made from salvaged rebar. The work took most of 2 springs. By the end of the second year, he had the 14 accumulated dump cycles, separated and documented, and he had a working map of the pile's color geography, laid out in a hand-drawn diagram that he taped to the inside of the barn wall above the workbench. The lapidary work came from his father's practice. Clem had polished agate on a flat lap, a simple horizontal grinding wheel, running through progressively finer grits. 220 silicon carbide to cut and shape, 600 to refine, and then cerium oxide powder on a felt wheel to bring the final surface to a glass polish. Harlan had watched him do it 100 times as a child, sitting on a 3-legged stool beside the bench, while Clem ran pieces of moss agate and banded jasper through the sequence, the dry whine of the wheel rising and falling as the grit changed. He adapted the method for the slag. The material was softer than agate, closer in hardness to soft obsidian, and he had to slow the lap speed and use a lighter touch because the slag would chip at the edges if you ran it too hard. The cerium oxide stage required patience. He went through 2 felt wheels, learning the right pressure, before he understood that the material wanted to be coaxed rather than worked. What came off the final cerium wheel was a surface with a depth that commercial fused glass simply did not produce, because commercial fused glass had been designed to be uniform. The slag had not been designed at all. The cerium wheel did not impose a surface on it. It revealed the one that was already there. His first finished pieces were cut pendants, simple oval cabochons with a drilled top. He sold 12 of them at the Philippi Barber County Fair in 2004, $15 each. He put the $180 in a coffee tin and went home and cut 6 more. The woman who had bought the amber piece from the spring 2001 dump section came back the following year looking for something in the same warm range, and Harlan showed her 3 from that section's catalog shelf. She took all 3 at the same price. He wrote the sale in the ledger beside the inventory notation. He did not have a register or a card reader or a banner with his name on it. He had a folding table and a piece of black velvet and, after 2006, a small, handwritten price card that Nadine's mother had laminated for him one Christmas. In the years between his first sale and Nadine's arrival in 2009, Harlan worked steadily through a system that looked, to any outside observer, like a series of small and unrelated decisions, but was, in fact, a single, continuous project. The sorting by dump date and season came first because Clem's notebook had taught him to think about the slag, not as a pile, but as a record, each dump cycle an entry from a particular point in the plant's seasonal rotation. He cross-referenced the dump dates against his own memory of the batchroom schedule, which he still carried with the precision of someone who had lived inside it for 17 years, and he began to see patterns. A February dump always ran heavier violet than a March one, because the decorative glass season typically wound down after the gift market holidays, and the furnaces transitioned back to flat glass sometime in early spring. An October dump was the richest for cobalt, because the fall decorative runs started with the furnaces freshly cleaned and the colorant concentrations high before the batch chemistry settled into the season's rhythm. He made a notation system from these patterns. He cross-referenced it with Clem's entries. The ledger grew. About 12 miles away in Kingwood, a jeweler named Del Pruitt had been running a small fused glass studio for 3 years by then, and Del was doing considerably better on paper. He had a Scut 1027 kiln he had financed at 7% interest, commercial bullseye sheet glass he ordered from a supplier in Cincinnati, and a catalog of colorants that could produce reliable, replicable color across production runs. Del's work was clean. It was consistent. Buyers at regional fairs knew what they were getting from him, and in a craft market that rewards consistency, that was worth something. His material costs ran between $180 and $240 a month. His gross in 2004 was just under $14,000, which looked, by every standard measure a craft business operates by, like a comfortable lead over the old man down the road selling $15 cabochons at county fairs. Del was not a villain in any of this. He had done everything correctly. He had researched his market, invested in proper equipment, bought from a reputable supplier. He was a good craftsman with a sensible business model, and none of what happened to him later was his fault. He had simply trusted a supply chain that had no reason to be loyal to him, and an efficiency model that had no room for an irreplaceable pile of slag sitting in a neighbor's yard. The Scut kiln ran glass to within 2 degrees of its target temperature on every firing. That kind of precision was worth paying for. And Del paid for it, and it gave him something Harlan's method could not give, which was a consistent, repeatable product that looked the same at a Morgantown fair as it had at the Elkins Fair 6 months before. The commercial colorants ran true. The supply chain was professional. Everything about Del's operation was designed to minimize the kinds of surprises that plagued a method built on a material you did not control and could not order more of. Del had made all the right choices. The problem was not the choices. The problem was what the choices were built on. Harlan's granddaughter, Nadine, drove out from Shepherd University in the summer of 2009, the summer before her final year. With her fine arts degree forming and her instructor's voice still fresh in her ears. She had grown up knowing about the Slag barn the way you know about a grandparent's habit. A quirky, slightly embarrassing detail you mention, with a rueful smile at parties. When she walked into the barn that July and saw the sorted sections of the pile, the color-keyed catalog ledger on the workbench shelf, the flat lap with its worn felt wheel, she said what she actually thought. "Grandpa, it looks like an industrial dump in here." Harlan looked at her. He picked up a finished piece from the shelf, a cobalt violet pendant he had cut the previous winter from a December 2006 dump section, and he held it out. "Look at this one," he said. Nadine took it. She turned it in the light. The color ran from a deep near navy at the crown of the cabochon to a softer violet at the belly, not by design but by the internal layering of the slag matrix. She said, "Where do you buy glass this color?" "You don't," Harlan said, and went back to the lap. She left without fully understanding what she had seen. She drove the 2 hours back to Shepherd with the pendant on the passenger seat of her car and spent the following morning at her studio bench, turning it under a daylight-corrected lamp, trying to identify the pigment source. She had a color theory textbook from her second year that cataloged common glass colorants. The pendant's cobalt violet was not in it. The internal layering, the way the color deepened not from the surface but from within the matrix, was not a phenomenon the book addressed, because it was not a phenomenon that occurred in manufactured glass. Manufactured glass was homogeneous by design. The color in Harlan's pendant was the result of a furnace running at the edge of a batch transition. the residual from one season's oxide mix bleeding into the next, compressed under its own weight during cooling and locked in by the slag's slower, uncontrolled annealing. Nobody had designed it. Nobody could have. She came back the following summer, and the summer after that, and somewhere in the summer of 2010, watching a piece come out of the annealing oven, a slow, cool chamber Harlan had built from a surplus kiln casing to prevent thermal shock cracking. She understood that the color was not incidental to the slag. The color was the slag. It was the only material in the world that had been heated to that specific combination of oxides at those specific temperatures in that specific sequence, and it was sitting in a sorted pile behind her grandfather's barn in Preston County, West Virginia. Because a plant manager had decided it had no value, she started coming out on weekends to help with the sorting and cataloging. She was good at the color notation. Her fine arts training gave her a vocabulary for it that Harlan's more instinctual system had not required, and together they built a notation system that annotated each sorted section with both a visual color description and the dump date, an estimated batch type from Harlan's records and Clem's notebook. By 2011, the ledger ran to 240 pages and covered 16 dump cycles, indexed 3 ways, by date, by color family, and by a cross-reference system Nadine had devised that linked each section to the corresponding entry in Clem's notebook when one existed. The ledger that had begun as a practical inventory had become a document with the density of a real archive. Nadine photographed each sorted section and built a parallel visual catalog on her laptop, a digital supplement to Harlan's hand-recorded pages. Clem had started the observation 30 years before. Harlan had continued it through 17 years in the batch room and 14 more at the barn. Nadine was the third generation, adding her own hand to the record. If you have ever discovered that someone in your family had been doing something carefully and methodically for years, and you simply hadn't thought to look, you know something of what Nadine felt in that barn. Drop a comment about what you found. Del Pruitt's costs began climbing in 2011. His Cincinnati supplier raised prices on commercial bullseye sheet glass by 22% that year, citing raw material and energy costs. Del passed some of it on and absorbed the rest. He adjusted his kiln schedule, ran more efficient loads, and ordered less inventory, which meant he had less flexibility on the production side, but kept the margin from collapsing entirely. In 2012, his supplier raised prices again, this time by a further 12%, and discontinued 3 of the colorant lines Del had built his most popular color palette around. Del spent the better part of that fall sourcing replacement colorants from a distributor in Pittsburgh, and the colors were close but not the same, and his repeat buyers noticed. His gross in 2012 was $22,000. His material costs had risen to $14,000. His net was $8,000. He was not ruined. He was, by any careful accounting, working very hard for $8,000 a year. At the Preston County Chamber of Commerce meeting in 2007, Vitrea Glass had presented a modest expansion proposal for the south end of the plant. During the question period, a member asked about the ongoing slag dumping arrangement with the property adjacent to the south perimeter. Warren Solt, then 4 years into the plant manager role, and looking ahead to a regional vice president's position, handled the question without breaking stride. "The gentleman has a standing arrangement to collect it," Solt said, consulting nothing. It keeps our disposal costs down. It's a hobby, far as we can tell. Scrap obsession, maybe? We're not worried about the old glassworkers' sentiment about color." The chamber laughed pleasantly and moved on. Harlan was not at the meeting. He heard about it from the county extension agent who had been seated in the third row. He listened without changing expression, thanked the agent, and drove home. Rue was at the gate when he pulled in. He led her in the truck for the last half-mile of the lane, which was not something he did often. By 2013, he was selling at regional craft fairs in Morgantown and Elkins and Charleston at $45 to $75 per piece, depending on the color and the cut. He was not moving large volume. He was not trying to. The pieces that came out of the December runs, the cobalt-heavy winter's slag sections, were the ones that went first and at the upper end of his price range. He had begun keeping a small selection back from every fair, a reserve he did not put out for sale, because Nadine had told him the palette was irreplaceable, and he should act accordingly. He had nodded and done exactly that. The reserve shelf in the barn held 41 pieces by the end of 2012, drawn from across the full 14-year color range. The amber spring pieces beside the violet and cobalt winter sections, beside the rare turquoise-green copper oxidation material from the 2008 dump. It looked to anyone who walked into the barn and saw it like an inventory. To Harlan and Nadine, it looked like a record of time. That same year, a buyer from a craft gallery in Lewisburg came to Harlan's table at the Charleston Fair and spent 20 minutes handling every piece on the display board. She bought 4 at $60 and $70 each and left her card and said she would be in touch. She called in January of 2013 and asked if he could supply 8 pieces for a spring show. He said he could do 6. He sent 6. She sold all 6 in the first week of the show and called back to ask if there were more in the cobalt-violet range. He said there were not many of those left in the current production run, but he had some from a 2009 section that were close. She said she would take whatever he could send. He sent 4 more. She sold those too. In the fall of 2013, Vitrea Glass announced the closure of the Preston County facility. The decision had been made at the corporate level in response to a consolidation plan that shifted production to a lower-cost facility in Monterrey, Mexico. The announcement was made at a press conference at the Morganfield Civic Center, and Warren Solt, now regional vice president, was the one who read it. A local reporter asked about legacy impacts on the surrounding community. Solt acknowledged the job losses, the severance package, the transition assistance. When the reporter followed up and asked specifically about the slag dumping arrangement on the south perimeter, Solt paused and then said, "The slag arrangement ends with the plant. I don't expect that's a significant economic impact. It was always more of a rockhound situation than a commercial enterprise." Harlan heard it on the radio in the barn. Rue was at his feet. He turned the radio off and sat for a moment in the quiet, and then he went to the ledger and turned to the last page of active entries. He had 14 years of sorted, cataloged, color-notated slag in sections behind the barn, an estimated 4.2 tons across 14 annual dump cycles, sorted by season, by color family, by the Clem-derived notation system, by Nadine's finer vocabulary, laid over the top of it. The supply had ended. The pile had not. What Vitrea had considered waste and had disposed of at his gate as an act of convenience was now a finite and unrepeatable inventory of a color palette that existed nowhere else in the world. Del Pruitt's supplier discontinued 2 more colorant lines in December of that year. Del drove to Pittsburgh and sourced what he could. The colors were close. They were not the same. The Morgantown Regional Craft Fair in the spring of 2014 ran across a weekend in late April in a civic center on a high street, and Harlan set up at a table in the East Corridor with a padded jeweler's display board and 23 pendant pieces arrayed on it. 14 came from the winter cobalt sections, 6 from the spring amber runs, and 3 from a particularly unusual December 2008 dump that had run a deep turquoise green where the copper oxidation had come through in a visible matrix. Nadine was at the table with him. She had cataloged every piece on the board by dump date and batch type notation before they left Preston County, and she had priced them in a range between $55 and $90. Marion Cross arrived at the table at 11:17 in the morning and did not speak immediately. She walked the length of the display board slowly. She picked up the turquoise green piece from the 2008 dump, turned it once and set it down. Then she picked up the cobalt violet piece from December 2006, the same pendant Harlan had shown Nadine in 2009. She held it to the light from the east windows of the Civic Center, and the light came through at a low morning angle, and the pendant did what it always did in that quality of light, which was to deepen from the surface down in a way that had no bottom. She held it for 47 seconds. 47 seconds is a long time at a craft fair table. Nadine watched the clock on the far wall. Harlan stood still with his hands at his sides. Marion Cross set the pendant down and said, "Where do you source the glass?" Harlan said, "It's Slag, from the Vitrea plant in Morganfield." Marion Cross looked at him. She said, "I want all 23 pieces, $800 each." She did not ask about materials. She did not offer a lower figure to open a negotiation. She did not consult a tablet or reference a catalog. She named the price the way a person names a fact they have already verified. $18,400. The room did not stop. The fair continued around the table. At the table, something had settled, the way a weight settles when you put it finally down on solid ground. Nadine looked at the display board. She looked at her grandfather. Harlan nodded once. Marion Cross returned the following morning with a check. She also had a card from the Craft Alliance Gallery and a request for Harlan to contact her about a consignment arrangement. She spent 11 minutes at the table asking him about the sorting system, the lap method, the cerium finish. She wrote in a small notebook as he talked. When she left, she said she would expect to hear from him within the month. Warren Solt heard about the fair from the county extension agent, the same one who had told Harlan about the chamber meeting in 2007. The agent, a deliberate man named Ray, had been at the Civic Center on other business and had seen the table in the East Corridor and had understood, slowly and then all at once, what he was looking at. He called Solt that Monday. Solt drove down from his regional office in Clarksburg on the following Wednesday. He asked to see the barn. Harlan showed him. He walked Solt through the sorted pile sections behind the barn first, pointing out the seasonal divisions, the color family groupings, the tags he had tied to the boundary stakes between sections. He explained the dump date notation system. He showed Solt the February 2004 section beside the October 2004 section and pointed to the difference in the surface color of the material. The amber-dominant spring pile beside the violet shift fall pile, 12 inches of sorted distance representing 8 months of furnace chemistry. Solt looked at it for a long time. Inside, he showed him the color-keyed ledger, open to a middle page, the notation columns across the top, and the entries below in Harlan's careful hand. Each section documented by date and estimated batch type and visual color description and yield in pounds. He showed him Clem's notebook on the shelf, open to a page from 1962, and pointed to a color observation Clem had recorded about a December batch run that matched almost exactly the notation Harlan had written 50 years later for the December 2003 dump. The furnace had not changed its chemistry. Only the people paying attention to it had changed. He showed him the flat lap with the worn felt wheel. He showed him the annealing chamber Nadine had helped insulate the previous winter, its door sealed with a strip of ceramic fiber blanket, its interior still warm from the piece he had cooled that morning. He showed him the reserve pieces on the shelf that had not gone to the fair, 41 pendants laid out on a length of black velvet, the full color range of 14 years arranged in seasonal order, amber to violet to cobalt, to the 3 turquoise-green pieces from the 2008 copper run at the far end. Solt stood in the barn for a long time without saying anything. He picked up a piece from the reserve shelf, one of the amber spring sections, a piece from the 2003 pile, and turned it in the light from the barn window. He looked at Harlan. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since my father showed me," Harlan said. Solt set the piece down carefully. He did not offer a post hoc claim or a contractual argument. He said, "I owe you a better look than I gave this." It was not a speech. It was a short-level sentence from a man whose model had been genuinely wrong at the time horizon that mattered, and who was decent enough to say so without theater. He asked if he could bring a Vitrea materials engineer out the following month. Harlan said he would think on it. Word moved through Preston County the way word moves in small places, which is sideways and in all directions simultaneously. Ray, the extension agent, had been at the fair. He talked to 2 neighbors at the Morganfield feed store that Monday morning, and by midweek the phone had rung at the barn 3 times. By the end of that summer, 4 neighbors had come out to the barn asking questions, and Harlan had spent a Saturday afternoon in August showing Ray Dunlap and his daughter Carla how to read a slag section for its color family, how to feel for the fracture lines before you set the lap, how to identify a copper oxidation run from a piece of the 2008 pile he had set aside for teaching purposes. The fracture lines mattered because slag that was pulled too fast from the dump cycle still carried internal stress, and a piece with a stress fracture would blow off the edge of the lap and be useless. You had to hold it to the light at a low angle and look for the hairline. Harlan had learned to see them. He showed Carla what to look for and watched her hold a piece up to the barn window and find the line herself. He gave Ray 3 sorted sections of late-period material to practice on. He sold Carla 6 pendant blanks at cost so she could learn to finish them herself. She came back the following month with 5 of them cut and polished and 1 cracked at the lap edge, and Harlan looked at the 5 and said they were good. Del Pruitt came out in the fall. He was a quiet man, and he did not pretend things were easy. He said his supplier situation had gotten worse, and he had been considering whether to close the studio. His scut kiln was paid off, which meant no financing cost, but the commercial colorant situation had not improved. And without the specific color range his repeat buyers knew him for, the consistency that had been his competitive advantage was eroding. Harlan listened. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he walked Del out to the sorted pile sections and pointed to the spring amber material, the iron oxide heavy runs from the flat glass seasons. He said that color would fire differently in a kiln than on a lap, because Del's process involved remelting and Harlan's involved cold polishing, and Del would have to experiment to learn the temperature thresholds before the material began to devitrify, which was what glass did when you remelted it incorrectly, losing its glassy surface and turning opaque. He said the amber runs were the most forgiving for a first experiment because the iron oxide was stable across a wider temperature range than the cobalt or manganese sections. He gave Del a section of spring amber material, enough for 20 pendants, and wrote down the grit sequence on a card in case Del wanted to try the cold polish method instead. He showed him the lap speed and the cerium stage. He said Dell would have to work out the color notation system himself, but the mechanism was the same as agate. Dell thanked him and drove back to Kingwood. He came back the following April with 12 pieces he had fired in the scut at a conservative 1,400 degrees, and the amber had held. The color was not the same as Harlan's cold, polished pieces because the kiln firing changed the internal structure. But it was a color that had not existed in Dell's studio before, and Dell knew what that was worth. Nadine took over the studio management in 2015. She registered the operation as a sole proprietorship under the name Buse Glassworks, which Harlan thought was an odd name for something that had never used a glass furnace, but he did not argue. She and Harlan spent the winter of 2014 formalizing the catalog into a bound volume, indexing it by dump date, batch type, color family, and the Vitrea product line notations they had reconstructed from Clem's notebook and Harlan's own batchroom memory. The volume ran to 312 pages. It was typed and printed at the Morganfield Library and kept in 2 copies. One stayed on the shelf in the barn beside Clem's notebook, and one went with Nadine to her apartment in Morgantown, where she had taken a studio space near the university. The Craft Alliance consignment arrangement with Marion Cross produced, over the following 2 years, $43,000 in sales from the reserve and continued production, with Nadine managing the finishing work and Harlan overseeing the sorting and the lap. In 2016, the Craft Alliance mounted a small solo exhibition of Harlan's work under the title Vitrea Remnants, 12 pieces drawn from across the full color range, each labeled with its dump date and batch type notation. The catalog essay, which Nadine wrote, described the sorting system and the lapidary method and the 3-generation observation record from Clem's notebook through the current bound volume. Harlan did not expand the operation. He was not interested in expansion. He had 11 acres, an assorted pile, and a flat lap, and a granddaughter who could finally see what he saw in a piece of glass held to the light, and that was the right size for what this was. When a business investor from Charleston came out in 2016 to talk about scaling the brand and sourcing similar slag from other regional glassworks, Harlan heard him out and then said, "The color comes from this plant's chemistry. You can't buy it somewhere else." The investor asked about slag from the Fenton plant in Williamstown, which was still running. Harlan said the Fenton chemistry was different. The colorant concentrations and the batch type sequence were different, and what you would get from Fenton slag would be its own thing, not this thing. The investor left a card. Harlan put it on the shelf and did not call. Let me tell you what was actually sitting at that gate in October of 1998. There are 2 kinds of knowing that operate in this story, and they have been in collision since the first dump truck backed up the gravel lane. One kind of knowing's what Warren Solt brought to Preston County. It was credential-built, ledger-tested, efficient, reliable within its own frame, and genuinely confident. It measured value in disposal costs and haul fees and unit production totals, and by those measures, the slag at Harlan Buse's gate was worth less than nothing. It was a cost saved by giving it away. The other kind of knowing came from a pot room worker who had spent his evenings writing color observations in a composition notebook, and from his son who had memorized those observations through 17 years on the same floor and another 14 years sorting slag by hand on the ground outside his barn. That kind of knowing measured value in what a piece of glass did in a specific quality of light at a specific angle, and in the mineral combination that a furnace had produced once and would never produce again. It did not have a ledger column. It had a worn field notebook and a flat lap, and a 47-second silence from a buyer who understood exactly what she was looking at. What is rigid breaks when the ground shifts. What is rooted in a particular piece of ground, in the patient reading of its specific material, in the accumulated observation of years and generations, does not break. It simply waits. The plant closed. The slag stopped coming. The pile remained sorted and cataloged in its sections behind the barn. Harlan had known since 1998 what he had. He had simply waited for the world to develop the vocabulary to say so. Clem's notebook sits on the shelf in the barn, beside its typed and indexed continuation. Rue is old now, and she sleeps near the lap, and the light through the barn window in the afternoon still does what it has always done to a piece of glass held at the right angle. What belongs to a place tends to stay there. What is patient tends to outlast what is confident. That is not sentiment. That is what the ledger says.